Father, we want to thank you this evening, and we can begin the study on this lovely book, short book as it is, and the Old Testament book of Ruth, and gives us a wonderful story and possibly many helpful and spiritual lessons and that we can learn. So we ask you, Lord, to be with us throughout this entire journey as we go to Ruth and look at the text and allow your spirit to teach us and to lead us and to guide us. So we commit our session to today and the sessions for the next 3 weeks. And to you, be our teacher, be our guide. And may the lovely the story of Ruth and Naomi and also of Boaz and be an inspiration and be an example to us to be faithful and to honor you and to believe that you are God who will provide if we trust you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, today we're going to start looking at this very short book, the book of Ruth, one of the smallest book and shortest book in the Old Testament in the Bible. And I think that then we will be able to learn quite a bit. Now, just by way of introduction, and how many of you have never read the book of Ruth? And raise your hands. And you have a icon thing, and you can then if you raise a hand like that, okay. And how many of you have never read and the book of Ruth? How many of you have read? Okay. Then the book of Ruth, but have forgotten what the story is all about. Raise your hands. Okay. Like that. All right. So I assume all of you have read the book of Ruth and you are familiar with the story of Ruth, right? Okay. Actually, then if you remember, then those of you who were with us and from the beginning, and Ruth was actually the first book that we studied, and but some of you weren't there, so you probably do not know. And so we are revisiting this book, and maybe you can remember or may have forgotten some of the things that we have taught during that session. All right. But most of you know the story of Ruth. And all right, so let's begin with some very basic questions. And what is this book about? What is it? What spiritual lesson do you think that it is trying to teach us? What do you think are the lessons, or is the lesson, or and this book of Ruth, does God intend to teach us? Or what do you learn or when you read book, the book of Ruth? What do you get from it? What does it say to you? Since no one raised your hand just now, and so you all say that you all read it and you are familiar with the story and you have not forgotten. So you must have some idea and what the book of Ruth is all about. Not a trick question. We're not going to bite anybody. Okay. just like to know where you are at? Anybody? What is Ruth all about?
Ruth was faithful to her mother-in-law.
Okay. Ruth was faithful to mother-in-law. So is
And
the lesson to teach daughter-in-laws to be faithful to the mother-in-law?
Pastor, I think it's a family value.
Family value. And what family
Family value, submission to the in-laws and all these things, you see.
laws and okay. All right.
I think can you hear me?
Stephen,
Yeah, I think Ruth is a very loyal person
loyalty.
and yeah, and very bold lady.
Old lady, boldness, loyal. Very good. Anyone else?
Through the book of Ruth, we learn the ancestry of Jesus.
Okay. Oh, Ruth gives us the ancestry of Jesus. Okay. All right. Okay. Anyone else?
God will make a way.
God will make a way. Okay. God's providence, God's provision. Okay. Good. Anyone else?
Ruth married one of the sons of Naomi. So even though the husband and the son, her own Ruth's own husband died,
Okay.
she's already in the same family as Naomi. But though the people around her died, she continued to be faithful to that family.
Okay. All right. She's faithful to her mother-in-law, to the family of the mother-in-law, even though her husband died. Okay. All right. So it's a lesson that if you are married and your husband died, you be faithful to your mother-in-law.
I think
Sorry.
it's Ruth kindness and her loyalty to the mother-in-law, and also can see God's kindness and God's love and God's care for the widow.
Right.
I think.
All right. Okay. Anyone else?
From my understanding, I think God, Jesus through Ruth, the book of Ruth, show us that how he helped us, his presence and his blessings, in our life.
All right.
He show that our normal life, you see, he does care and he does help, and help us to go through all these obstacles
Okay.
in
All
our
right.
life.
Okay. Good. Good.
I think
All
we learn the redemption process of the past.
Okay. Redemption from the past. Okay. Very deep. Last Sunday was Mother's Day, right? How many of you ever heard the story of Ruth being used and a text and in Ruth used as a biblical text for a Mother's Day's message? Raise a hand. Okay. And raise a hand like that. Okay. How many of you have ever heard a message on Mother's Day, a Mother's Day's message based on the book of Ruth? No one? Wow. Keelan, okay, good. Anyone else? All right. You remember who preached the message, Keelan? Do you remember who preached the message that you heard?
Cannot remember lah, Pastor.
Okay.
So many years.
So most likely not me lah. And but actually I have used in the book of Ruth and as an text and to then preached on Mother's Day. And I don't think that it was in Bethel Tabernacle. I don't think it was in carries, and I don't think Keelan, you heard me preach on the message. I don't think it's me, but someone else. Okay, all right, okay. Thank you very much, and I think that is very good and contribution and participation from all of you. Okay, now let's go to the book itself. All right, okay, this is not what I want. Okay. Right. Okay. Now, in the NIV, then it says that this is a story of love and loyalty between two widows that shines brightly in an otherwise dark period of Israel's history. It takes place during the time of Judges and tests the fact that with God, there's always hope for a brighter future. That is the editors of the New International Version, scholars who edited the NIV Bible. All right, or maybe it is someone else and not the actual translators, but someone who compiled and put all the books together and in NIV. Maybe someone else did that. The notes are not necessary from the translators. And okay, anyway, okay. There's quite a lot of discussion among scholars as to why and this book is in the Bible. And this book, and it says that it takes place in the days when the judges ruled. And that's very kind of ominous. And because if you remember the judges, the period of judges is a period and that's rather chaotic. There is all kinds of people sin against God, and then hand them over to the enemies. The people cry to God, and God delivered them. And so you would think someone would say that the book of Judges covers what we call a dark ages or a dark period in Israel's life. There was a period when there were no kings and there was also no law. And this was a time when everybody did what was right in its own eyes. And in fact, one of the last story and in the book of Judges is have the same what we call the provenance, and it talks about a man who took a wife from Bethlehem, and you'll find that the story in book of Ruth also talk about a man from Bethlehem in Judah. That was a very terrible story, and you go back and read the last few chapters of Judges, and you'll find that there's a horrible, horrible story, and something that maybe the sort of Ruth is here to counterbalance. And sometimes when we think that there are dark periods and everything goes wrong, everything becomes very dark, the whole world seems to be going wrong, and there are all kinds of wickedness around the world, and but in the midst of wickedness, sometimes there are little pockets of goodness, little light that shines. And some say the book of Ruth shines in that very dark period. Perhaps that is a kind of relevance of book of Ruth can have for us. As we look at our world today, it seems to be chaotic. There is war in the Middle East. There is war in Eastern Europe. There are tensions all around the world. China and Russia and US is a loggerheads and over trade wars, and then there are in Africa. There are all kinds of situations. The Middle East, not only the Palestinians and Israel, but also Iran and Saudi and Iraq and Israel, then are all caught up in some kind of international conflict. And so then in our country, we find there are all kinds of problems and things seem dire, and some people are seeing a lot of hopelessness. But in the midst of all this, God is still faithful, and we can see stories and testimonies of God's faithfulness, not in necessarily the big things in the world, but in small things. And the book of Ruth doesn't really deal with any big a story, except that this was a story that had a link to King David, and God provided a king through the story of Ruth. And in Judges, there was a time there was no king, and then David come along, and God made him the king, and this was the ancestry of David. And so some people think that the story of Ruth is basically to tell the story of David and give us kind of a linkage to David. And is that necessary to tell this kind of story about David and how he came about? Now, I'll come back to it a little while, and I think that those scholars who make a connection with David are on the right track to a certain extent. And but there were other scholars who saw the book of Ruth, which was, no one knows when Ruth was written. Okay, the story is about the time during the Judges, and there was no indication of who wrote it, how the story was preserved, and there was no indication of the person who wrote this book. This is why he wrote the book. The previous lesson that we have about John's Gospel, the author John, and at the very end declares very clearly, and these are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, that by believing in him you might have eternal life. But in the book of Ruth, there was no such statement of purpose. There's no such statement, this is why this story was written. So we have to guess. We cannot be 100% sure. So most of us are curious, and scholars are curious, why is this book in the Bible? What is its purpose? Well, it has lessons. You can learn a lot of things from it. But those lessons doesn't necessarily indicate why it was written. And clearly, maybe one of those lessons could be the main reason why it is written, and why this book of Ruth is written. Anyone like to venture? Why do you think that a book of Ruth was written and included in the Old Testament? Why do you think the book of Ruth was written? Anyone? Is it to tell the story of David? Possibly. Anyone else has a different thing? A very popular view among Old Testament scholars and in earlier times, and not so popular now. It kind of fizzled out, and there are a lot of people who criticized that view for a variety of reasons. But at one time, it was seen to be the current and a view for the authorship, for the purpose of the book. One of the books that we are supposed to, in fact, one of the books that we were then suggested for the study, and before someone suggested Ruth, and it was Ezra and Nehemiah. And during Ezra and Nehemiah, and if you study that book, you'll find that one of the problems that they face after the exile, the post-exilic period, is about Israelites marrying foreign women. And Ezra, Nehemiah, especially Ezra, as well as Nehemiah, and was very, very concerned because marrying foreigners and marrying what we call people who are not faithful to Yahweh and to Jehovah, would lead them into a time of apostasy, and they would go. And so you find that Ezra and Nehemiah opposed this interracial marriage and also interreligious marriage, and forcibly made the Jewish community the men to give up their wives. And on one level, there is justification for that, because then that seems to be then the example of Solomon, and there are also the examples even in our own time of people who marry, and men who marry their wives and tends to follow their wives. And but something that the book of Ruth was written as a kind of a protest against the overly strict policy, and not necessarily against Israel and Nehemiah, but the policy that enacted that would not allow for any of what we call extenuating circumstances or consideration, and became very, very legalistic, and became, in one sense, tend to become very racist. So this book was written to show how even King David, the king that God anointed, the king and of the people, then the Messiah will come as a descendant of King David, and he is born, or his lineage, his great-great-grandmother was a foreigner from Moab. And so if David, who they cannot question his lineage, they cannot question his pedigree, and if he had a Moabite great-grandmother, then there should be a little bit more consideration and about marrying foreign wives. So some say that this is a kind of protest literature, and thinking that, or arguing that this book is actually a product of the post-exilic period. And for a while, particularly among not so conservative, among the more liberal scholars, this held what we call and the attention of the scholars. But later you find that more and more scholars began to poke holes in that kind of understanding. And if you look at the book of Ruth, even though it talks about the story of Ruth, who is a Moabitess, there actually are no indications and no notes of protest. There is nothing there to indicate it is a protest literature. Is anything there that we read that it was meant to protest against the policy of Ezra and Nehemiah? And so that kind of justification, that kind of understanding began to lose favor. Of course, some try to resurrect and try to save that. It's not a protest literature. There's no overt protest against foreign wives. It's more of a subversive, it tells a story in a very innocent way but kind of undercut. And so it is meant to subvert the idea that interracial marriage or interreligious marriage is bad. And well, most scholars are not really think that and buy into that. This idea of subversive literature may and carry the day in modern literature, because modern literature tends to be subversive, but ancient people are not probably that kind of subtle. Then if they want to protest, they will probably protest in a much more open way. And so that theory probably doesn't really carry weight. On the other extreme, then they are saying, people will say that, oh, this is just a story that talks about loyalty, that talks about faithfulness, that talks about and how God in a very dark time, in a very dark period, and can save and redeem and a person who intends to be faithful to God. And well, there's a lot actually to going for that. Especially if you set this book in what we call in a link with Judges, and it may basically provide as a kind of a justification for that book. Probably if you read a book in this sense, yeah, spiritually that seems to be the story of loyalty, of faithfulness, of love, of commitment, and that's one of the very primary lessons that we can learn, and a very important spiritual lesson. However, I wondered whether that is really the reason why this book of Ruth is in there. And one of the issues I have with that kind of a spiritual purpose is that, yes, in our English Bible, the book of Ruth follows Judges. So the English Bible, you have Judges and then Ruth. So you find that the line that you have, and if you look at you have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, and definitely, and in the in the beginning, and you say in the days when the judges ruled. Okay. However, this outline is a very recent outline, and it follows the Greek Bible, and to a large extent, and the Hebrew Bible actually have the story of Ruth in a different place. You have this is the Jewish Bible, and called the Tanakh, and published by the Jewish Publication Society. And you have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, and then 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. And then Ruth is all the way down after the Song of Solomon, Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentation, Esther, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. Okay, you'll find that in these 5 books are part of what we call a collection of books that's found in what we call the Jewish section called the Writings. In our English Bible, our division of the Bible is, first you have the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then you have what we call the historical books, and so you have Judges, Ruth, Samuel, and all the way to Esther. These are books of history. And then you have the poetical books. Then your Job, then the Psalm, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs. Then later on you have what we call the prophetic books, and that line up and in Malachi as the last book of the Old Testament. Okay. The Hebrew Bible had a different and how we call and structure. The Tanakh is called Tanakh because it is basically in three and divisions. The first division is called the Torah, that is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then you have what we call the Nephiim, the prophetic books. And the prophetic books include Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, Kings, 2 Kings, which is called the former prophets. And then you have called Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Joel, and all that. And then you have the latter prophets and the rest of the prophets. That's the 12 prophets, the small books of the prophets called the 12. And then after that, you have the division of the 10, what they call the writings. After Malachi, you have Psalms, you have Song of Solomon, Lamentation, Ecclesiastes, and you find that Daniel is here. Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, First Chronicles, these are called the writings. So Tanakh, and it is called Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. So the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And so Ruth is under the writings. Okay. Now, so Ruth, except for verse 1, doesn't really link and to the book of Judges and prominently. And let me give you the, let's see where I am here. Okay. This is the website and called, and if you look at it, it's called a Jewish Virtual Library. And there is a section called the 5 Scrolls. The 5 Scrolls, okay.
Pastor, different slide.
Okay, or different slide. Okay, resume share. Let's see. All right. Oh, I see. Okay, should actually go carefully to that. Okay, I don't know why it ever. And okay. All right, now you see it? Share. Okay. So this is the 5 Scrolls. This is from what we call, you look at the heading up there. There is a Jewish virtual library. This is a Jewish site. The 5 Scrolls is a section. And let's see. Let's see whether I can. The 5 Scrolls called the Megilloth. Hamish is 5 Megilloth scrolls. Is destination for the 5 shortest book of the writings, the Hagiographa, the Ketuvim, Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentation, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. And all right, okay. The Song of Songs, and they're called the 5 because they are read during what we call the, some of the very important Jewish festivals. The Song of Solomon is actually read in during the Passover. So you find the song in Ashkenazi ritual, and this was the Passover. Ruth is read in Shavuot. Shavuot is the Hebrew name for day of Pentecost. So this Sunday is going to be a Pentecost. And so in the Jewish synagogue, they will be reading the book of Ruth, and it's read on the 2nd day of Shavuot. That is Ruth. And the association with Pentecost is based on a seasonal reference to the beginning of the barley harvest, on the traditional belief that King David, whose genealogy concludes the book, was born and died on Shavuot, the day of Pentecost. And a parallel and drawn between Ruth embracing the Jewish faith and Israel's accepting the Torah and on Mount Sinai on Shavuot. So then, so this is a Jewish and what we call tradition. So you find that the Jews have a different and understanding, and from then how to constitute the book of Ruth. Okay, and definitely it was somehow linked to King David, and I don't think that it's necessary to say that this book of Ruth then has to do with the ancestry of King David. If I think, if I'm correct, I could be wrong. Okay, this is just an I'm convinced by this opinion. Okay, this is not my original opinion. This is opinion of some scholars I respect and I follow, and that the book of Ruth and was not written during the exile to talk about and the protesting and what we call interracial marriage or then marrying foreigners, but it has to do with an justification of David. See, David was a king, and if you do a very close reading of King David, now King David, after many centuries, many years later on, is never really what we call and what we call and questioned and as the man after God's own heart. But I think King David, in his own historical context, was probably not that prominently or universally accepted and as the king. And if you read it very carefully, he was king first over Judah, and then later he was king over all Israel. And then there were also remnants of the followers of Saul, and that thinks that King David is a usurper. And he basically kind of supplanted and then what we call then Saul's family. And later on, you find that a division of the what we called and the nation, the kingdom of King David into the northern kingdom. We call themselves the tribe of Joseph or the tribe of Ephraim and Judah, and we indicate that King David was not necessarily universally accepted as God's anointed during his lifetime. The very fact that he could easily and be subject to revolt by his own son, and when his own son tried to usurp, and King David had to run for his life, and it would indicate that his kingdom was not all that secure during his own time. And probably one of the reasons, maybe there are probably a lot of other reasons when you talk about politics, there are, and in Malaysia, then you have the UMNO, you have the PAS, you have DAP, you have MCA, and who would ever thought that UMNO and DAP and MCA were part of the unity government? But there's still all kind of tensions, and politics is very complicated. And but probably one of the possible reasons why David and doesn't have universal support is that he has within his what we call his heroes, his warriors, people that are not really from Israel. They were foreigners that David brought in. In fact, they were mercenaries that were brought in, and to one extent, when they're brought in, they worship and Israel, and all called Yahweh, and they adopted the religion of Yahweh. And so there were that kind of concern. Okay, the story of Ruth to show how even what we call David's ancestry, which is quite what we call well, probably not a secret. His mother was a Moabitess. But this story of a Moabite woman who exemplified loyalty, who exemplified faithfulness to God and to her mother-in-law, and how God blessed her, and how God honored her, and how the people at that time recognized, accepted her, even though she was a foreigner, was in one sense a kind of defense and for David and as the rightful king of Israel. That is not necessarily accepted by all scholars, but I think that is the most reasonable and understanding I have of the book of Ruth, that it is a story of a woman who is a foreigner, and the Jewish religion is not just about race, and Jews are not just because you are only ethnically Jews, therefore you can, but you can accept to worship Yahweh, you can accept Jehovah, and when you do that and you buy into the whole thing of the law, then you are faithfully accepted. And this is exemplified in also the story of Pentecost. And when this was a time that even then the Jewish nation accepted the law on Mount Sinai. And that's why Ruth is read on that day when a Moabitess woman became what we call a convert, and became what we call Jewish, what we call, and accepted and the faithfulness of God, and God faithfully honored her in that sense. So I find that this is probably the most reasonable understanding I have. You may not accept, that's fine. But this story has wonderful lessons to learn. There are spiritual lessons, and there are lessons that I think that we can help. Whatever the original purpose is, this is God's word, and God's word speaks afresh and speaks to us even in our own time. And we are not concerned with the lineage of David. We are not concerned with all that. We are concerned with how this book can speak to us today. All right. So, and in this story, we can turn back now to the story of Book of Ruth. Now, first of all, we find that the introduction is very interesting. This was a time the judges ruled, a very dark period, and there was famine in the land. Today, we don't think much about famine, and although, there are people that says that food security is going to be a big concern in the near future, and the wars and that are going to be played out in the near future, even within our lifetime, will be upon resources. And one resources is not just oil or but food. Food is very important. There was famine in the land, and when you look about famine in the land, and this ties up basically to the Torah, to the book of Genesis, and when the patriarchs, they are all called stories about famine, and so it kind of ties very nicely with and how God's faithfully and Abraham went down to Egypt, and Jacob went down to Egypt, and things like that. So the theme of famine. Now, why is that famine? Well, Middle East is quite what we call dry land, and famine is quite common in that part of the world. But interestingly, this famine is largely in Judah. Nearby Moab, there was no famine. And it's not very far away. It's probably about 30, 40, 50 miles away. And just across the river, they go over at Moab. So it's not a kind of a famine that is probably widespread and in that area. But probably that famine has to do probably with warfare. And we find that during this time, there was a time when Moab itself came and oppressed Judah, and probably the famine was caused by war and by destruction, and it was a very, very difficult situation. Anyway, whatever the cause of the famine is, the text never tells you why there was a famine or explain there was a famine, just there was a famine in the land. A man from Bethlehem in Judah. Okay, this was a man, Bethlehem. And interestingly, then Bethlehem is, the name of Bethlehem is House of Bread. A house of bread. Then the town is called House of Bread. Is probably, this is called the place where there is plentiful harvest. It's like, we call Kencang, okay, the rice bowl of Malaysia, the rice bowl of Selangor. And then you name a place called House of Bread. This is going to be a very fertile area. It's going to be a place where there's a lot of plenty. And so there was famine in the House of Bread, and kind of very contrasting kind of situation. So, and there was famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem, Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. He didn't migrate to Moab to live there permanently. The word is there to live for a while, to sojourn, a temporary situation, because the famine was probably, he felt. But interestingly, he was the only person who went. That is noted. Maybe there are others who went, it was not recorded, but this man went. As a story tells us, there were others who probably stayed in the land. And so this man, with his wife, with his 2 sons, went to the country of Moab. To go to the country of Moab is kind of interesting, because Moab in the Old Testament and in the history of the Jewish people in Israel is always seen as rather negative. The ancestry of Moab, and Moab is the product of incest, and one of Lot's 2 daughters and had a relation with the father and the Moab. And Moab has always been very unfriendly. And even though they are related, because Lot is Abraham's nephew, and so there is what they are called distant cousins. But they have not been very helpful, very friendly. When Israel was moving from Egypt back to the land, and in Judah, they asked permission to go to Moab, and the Moab did not allow them to go. Interesting enough, they were not allowed to fight Moab. If there were other what we call Canaanites who resisted them, who refused to let them go through, and they were there to fight, and the Israel, God told them to dispossess them. But Moab, no. Moab is somehow untouchable, because they're related, and they are not Canaanites. They are distant cousins of the Jewish people. Okay, but they are not very friendly. And in fact, during the book of Judges, the Moabites at one time oppress Judah, and they don't worship Yahweh. All right, they worship a god called Chemos, and who practice what we call certain unsavory practices like child human sacrifices and that. So for them to leave and go to Moab sound pretty, doesn't sound very positive. But nothing is said about that. The story basically introduce a man, his wife, 2 sons went to live in Moab. Doesn't even mention their name. The name comes in the next verse. His name was Elimelech. Elimelech is basically translated, my God is king, or and my God is king. God, Eli is king, Eli is God, Melech is king. And his wife's name was Naomi. Naomi later on is named as pleasant. Now, names in the Old Testament, and especially in the book of Ruth, then probably is significant and in some sense. And there are other people that are not named. Later on, the story, the kinsman who refused to take Ruth, and he was never named. There are other people who were never named. People who were named are important to the story. And in Old Testament times, names were important. And a man who says, God is my king, and oh, my God is king, recognizing the sovereignty of God, in a time of famine will leave God's land, Bethlehem, to go to Moab. Sounds a little bit problematic, right? Yeah. His wife's name is Naomi, means pleasant, but his two sons, Mahlon and Kilion. Mahlon are not very good names, and Mahlon basically has to do with an sickness, sickly. Kilion, the name is fragile, and if you look at the Hebrew dictionary, Mahlon is a sickly person. Okay, and that's in Ruth. And then Kilion is probably frail and mottled, and so kind of maybe giving a indication that something unpleasant is going to happen. Right. There were Ephratites, Ephrath, and from Bethlehem. The significance of being Ephratites from Bethlehem then is a clan, and possibly then the word Ephrathite, Ephrath, and was a name of Bethlehem and former name, and probably indicate that this family was pretty what we call then important in then. So even though especially you know that when Naomi came back, the people recognized her. Isn't this Naomi? Isn't this? So she was not a nobody, and she was, and so probably to be known as Ephratites would be probably they were a prominent family. They were probably one of the original people who were there. It's like, if you are descendants of Yap Aloy, then oh, you are from Yap Aloy family, then Keelan, do you know that Pastor Lawrence is later Yap Aloy, and it kind of distant kind of a thing. So it's a prominent family. And anyway, they went to Moab and lived there for a while. Now, verse 3. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. And they married Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. And Orpah and Ruth, the names may mean something, and but not so certain. The most popular understanding of Orpah is that she is a firm neck, some then translate as negatively stubborn, obstinate. But it can be seen as positive. It's a very strong character. And the other is Ruth. Ruth is friendly and a female companion of, friendship. Okay. And after they lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Kilion died. And Naomi was left with the two sons and the husband. Okay. Now, this is a very short kind of introduction. And we do not know when Elimelech died. We do not know whether that the sons married after the father died or before the father died. It was never really, it's not really clear. Yeah, they were there about 10 years. We're not sure when they were married. Possibly they were not married too long, I think, because it's unusual for them to be married 10 years. If we think that they were married 10 years, some people think that it is married 10 years, but to have no children after 10 years is quite unusual. Probably not so. And the very fact that Ruth and Naomi then would tell them, no, go back and to your father's house, and would indicate that they were not married that long, and how long it is, we can't be very sure, but definitely not long enough then to then indicate that they were childless. 10 years without children, people will have questions about that. Okay, but the story is very interesting in this sense. So now I'm going to stop here a little bit, and I think I've taken too long to look at the introduction, but I thought the introduction is important and to help set the setting. But this introduction and different people, pastors included and preachers included, and try to bring some lessons, which maybe yeah or maybe not. You find that there's a man in Bethlehem, God's country, in the time of famine, go over to the country of Moab, and God didn't tell them to go to Moab. They went to Moab. Is this an indication this man is a faithless man, unfaithful to God, and unfaithful? Then that's why, and this misfortune befell them. And this is a very, very common and even Old Testament idea that misfortune comes as God's punishment. And Ruth and Naomi might have seen that as God punishing her for disobedience and for going on. And then the idea that Naomi's children and Mahlon and Chilion married foreign wives and Moabitess wives, and therefore God's judgment, and therefore they died. Elimelech died because he disobeyed God, left God's land to go to Moab, and then Mahlon and Chilion aggravated the problem and married foreign women, and therefore they died, and there was God's punishment upon them. Now, I've heard that preached that way. I have heard that taught that way. I have seen I read commentaries that indicate that way. Possible. But I think that might be something that might be a possibility that you read from the text or into the text. And there's nothing in the text that indicate this was God's judgment upon them. There was no indication that this is a punishment of God upon them. There's never, I don't see that. You might think that it is, and there is a possibility that it is, but the text doesn't say it is. So I think that we're very careful with that. But even if it is, and a kind of a subtext, a kind of a background on that, that is not the main story. The main story is not God's punishment. The main story is God's redemption, as Keelan mentioned. The main story is God is faithful. The main story is that God will redeem and God will bring about, even though, and it has a very sad beginning. So in verse 6, when Naomi heard while she was in Moab, the Lord has come to the aid of his people. The Lord has visited his people. She and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from Moab. I think the prominent story in this here is not so much about no, don't do this, don't do that, and maybe yeah, there are things that we should not do. We should try to have faith in God. We should follow but marrying Moabiters is not forbidden. And there's no law in the Torah that say they cannot marry Moabiters. Okay, there is a law that says that the descendants of Moab cannot enter into the temple, into the synagogue, or into the tabernacle, but there is no actual provision in the law that says Moabiters is out of bounds in terms of marriage. Okay, yes, do not take Canaanite wives, do not take out any of the children, but Moabites are not Canaanites. I think you need to understand that. But still, they are not worshippers of, but as I will go to show, at least, and in the story of Naomi, in the story of Ruth, and at least Ruth decided to follow Yahweh and decided to change, decided to abandon the God of her people and to follow the God of Naomi. And why is that? Then I think it's important theme of the story, thread of the story that we can explore next week. All right. Okay. Okay, then let's